Big Shaq was escorted out of the hotel's VIP suite, quietly replaced by a white woman. But one call later, the Monarch wasn't just shaken, it was on the brink of collapse. The entire hotel learned the hard way: underestimate Big Shaq's quiet power, and face the reckoning. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Big Shaq arrived at the Monarch Hotel just after noon. The sun was high over Miami, washing the glass facade of the towering building in shimmering light. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor as he entered, drawing glances that flitted between admiration and something colder. Something that tried to hide behind the gloss of professional courtesy. Shaq's size and presence filled the lobby. Not just his towering frame, but the quiet, steady air of a man used to being seen, and not just for his wealth or fame. At the check-in desk, a thin-lipped man named Dalton barely glanced up from his screen, his tone practiced and clipped. "Good afternoon, sir. Do you have a reservation?" The question hung in the air, more pointed than polite. Shaq's gaze met Dalton's, unreadable, his smile soft and patient. "Yes, under O'Neill." His voice was calm, even. Dalton's fingers hesitated over the keyboard, lips tightening just a fraction before he nodded. From the corner of the lobby, a woman in a sharp navy suit, Erica, the assistant manager, watched. Her expression was polished neutrality, but there was a flicker in her eyes that the narrator caught for the audience, discomfort laced with calculation. She gestured toward a bellhop to retrieve Shaq's bags, the movement sharp and efficient. "Your suite is ready, Mr. O'Neill," she said, her voice sugar-coated but hollow. Shaq inclined his head, offering a quiet thank you, and followed the bellhop toward the elevator. As the elevator doors closed behind him, the lobby seemed to exhale, a subtle shift that wasn't lost on the narrator's voice. Beneath the surface of this elegant hotel pulsed an undercurrent of unspoken rules. Shaq's presence didn't fit their unspoken script. A man like him, no matter his wealth, didn't belong in the center of their pristine world. The narrator's tone darkened slightly, hinting at the rising tension that coiled beneath the surface. In the suite, the view stretched over the city and out to the glinting ocean. Shaq stood by the window, absorbing the silence. His phone vibrated, a text from his mother, Lucille, a simple message: "Hope you're enjoying yourself, baby. Remember, they see you. Don't let them shake you." He smiled softly, touched by the familiar warmth. But the narrator underscored the tension, because even as Shaq soaked in the view, the sense of unease lingered. Downstairs, Dalton and Erica exchanged a look. Erica's voice dropped, low enough to avoid carrying, but sharp enough to cut. "We have a situation. There's been a request to move Mr. O'Neill from the VIP lounge reservation." Dalton's brows furrowed, but he didn't question it. "Orders came from above." He nodded curtly. "I'll handle it." The narrator pulled the audience closer, painting the quiet cracks forming in the hotel's polished image. The Monarch wasn't just a hotel. It was a symbol of exclusivity, a stage where appearances were everything, and now those appearances were threatened. Shaq descended to the lounge later that afternoon, his steps measured and confident. The staff's smiles were tighter now, their greetings forced. He took a seat by the window, overlooking the garden, his mind The narrator's voice softened, revealing Shaq's internal dialogue. His exhaustion with playing the part of the gracious guest, his weariness with being measured by his skin, and not his spirit. But he remained composed, his presence a quiet challenge. A white woman entered the lounge, a vision of casual opulence. Diamond earrings glinting, her posture a studied nonchalance. She whispered something to the manager. Shaq watched, his expression unreadable. The manager approached, voice low and apologetic but edged with dismissal. "I'm so sorry, sir, but there's been an error with the reservation. We'll need you to vacate this space for another guest." Shaq's lips parted slightly, but no words came. The narrator filled the silence, a low murmur threading through the scene. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a message. The woman's smirk flickered at the corner of her mouth, a silent victory claim. Shaq stood, his movement graceful, deliberate. His voice, when it came, was soft enough to cut steel. "I understand." He didn't argue, didn't plead his case. His dignity was a weapon sharper than anger. He left the lounge, his steps unhurried, his head high. The narrator's tone deepened, folding in threads of empathy and quiet rage. Here was a man who could crush them with a word, but chose silence. A man who saw the machinery behind the polished smiles and decided to walk away for now. Outside, Shaq's breath caught in his throat. The sun was still bright, the sky an endless blue, but the taste of injustice lingered. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over a familiar contact. His fingers moved slowly, dialing. The audience felt the weight of the moment, the pause before a storm. This wasn't just about a lounge or a room. This was about respect, dignity, and a refusal to let quiet cruelty go unchecked. As the phone rang on the other end, Shaq's shoulders squared, his stance solid against the soft ocean breeze. The narrator's voice dropped to a near whisper, the promise of what's to come thrumming beneath the surface. This wasn't over. The monarch had underestimated the quiet strength of the man they tried to dismiss. And as the narrator promised the audience, Big Shaq's next move would not just reclaim his place, it would shake the very foundations of the hotel itself. Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal returned to the VIP lounge of the Monarch later that afternoon, his tall frame casting long shadows against the polished floors. The room was an immaculate display of curated luxury, velvet seating, muted jazz notes threading the air, the clink of expensive glassware. But the air felt tighter now, heavy with an invisible weight. Staff members, once merely distant, now seemed poised at the edge of nervousness. Shaq, sensing the subtle shift, kept his expression neutral. He knew the signs, had read them 1,000 times over a lifetime, where silent doors and quiet dismissals whispered what no one dared say aloud. A woman entered the lounge, a presence that commanded attention without earning it. She wore her entitlement like a designer coat, her platinum blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her eyes scanning the room with practiced disinterest. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she approached the manager, her voice a low murmur meant to be overheard only by him. The manager's posture stiffened, his eyes darting toward Shaq, then back to her. There was a pause, the briefest hesitation before he nodded curtly. The narrator described the shift in the room as a tightening knot, an invisible thread drawing everyone's attention. The manager approached Shaq, his steps deliberate, his face composed but pale. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his tone carefully pitched between apology and authority. "I'm terribly sorry, but there's been a mix-up with the reservations. We're going to need you to vacate this space for another guest. Of course, your suite is still ready, and we'd be happy to provide you with complimentary services elsewhere." His words were smooth, polished, the kind used to placate and deflect, but underneath them ran a current of dismissal. Shaq's lips pressed into a line, his gaze fixed on the man. His heart pounded, but his voice, when it came, was steady. "A mix-up?" The question was quiet, almost gentle, but it carried weight. The manager's composure wavered, but he held firm. "Yes, sir. It appears there was an oversight in the booking process. This space was reserved for another guest." The woman's smirk flickered at the edges of Shaq's vision, her triumph unspoken but sharp as glass. The narrator leaned into the scene, drawing the audience's attention to the silent calculations at play. This wasn't a simple reservation error. It was an orchestrated insult, a reminder that even a man of Shaq's stature could be pushed aside when the unspoken rules of privilege demanded it. Shaq felt the heat rise in his chest, the sting of humiliation sharper because it was delivered with a smile. His fingers curled at his sides, but he didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. His silence was louder than any outburst could have been. Instead, he straightened, towering over the manager, his expression unreadable. "I see," he said softly. His words hung in the air, heavy with controlled disappointment. The manager swallowed hard, offering a rehearsed smile, a weak gesture toward the exit. Shaq's movements were slow, deliberate, each step measured, as he gathered his things. He caught the woman's eye as he turned, saw the flicker of something that wasn't quite satisfaction, perhaps surprise at his lack of resistance, perhaps confusion at his calm. The narrator's voice deepened, threading through Shaq's thoughts, as he left the lounge. This wasn't the first time he'd been underestimated, dismissed by those who saw his skin before they saw his worth. But it cut differently now. He was no longer a young man trying to prove himself. He was Shaquille O'Neal. Big Shaq, the man who had built himself up, brick by brick, with integrity and generosity. And still, here he was, being shown the door in favor of someone who wore entitlement, like a crown. Outside the lounge, the lobby hummed with muted activity, but Shaq felt the stares that lingered too long, the quick glances that slid away when he met them. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up with familiar contacts. His mind churned, not with anger, but with a cold, focused determination. This wasn't just about the lounge. It was about every quiet dismissal, every slight wrapped in false politeness, every smile that said one thing while meaning another. The narrator's tone grew sharper, hinting at the brewing storm beneath Shaq's calm surface. He thought of Lucille's text, her quiet reminder that they were always seen, always measured. He thought of his children, of the world they were growing into, where respect was still something that had to be demanded, not given. His thumb hovered over a number he hadn't called in a long time, a number that connected him not to revenge, but to the tools he needed to right a deeper wrong. As he pressed the call button, the narrator wove in the threads of suspense that would carry the audience forward. This wasn't a scene of fury, it was the quiet before the reckoning. Shaq's voice, when he spoke into the phone, was low, steady. "It's me. We need to talk." The person on the other end responded with swift understanding, their voice tight with urgency. The audience could feel the shift, the unspoken knowledge that this call would set in motion something far greater than a simple reclamation of a seat. Shaq's steps were calm as he moved through the hotel lobby, but the narrator layered in the tension that rippled beneath. The staff's polite nods and forced smiles no longer mattered. The insult had been delivered, but it wouldn't stand, and as the narrator hinted at what was to come, the audience was left with a sense of quiet anticipation, the promise that the next move would turn the tables in a way no one at the Monarch could have predicted. Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal stepped outside the Monarch, the thick glass doors closing behind him, with a muted thud that felt like the hotel's final word. The Miami sun blazed overhead, but the heat on his skin was nothing compared to the simmering indignation coiled tight within him. His broad shoulders squared as he walked toward the curb, each step slow and deliberate, his mind already racing through the next move. The audience could sense it, the quiet, coiled power of a man who refused to let disrespect pass without consequence. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and stared at the screen for a long moment. The contact at the top was more than a name. It was a key, a doorway to something larger than personal revenge. Shaq's thumb hovered for a heartbeat, then pressed down. The phone rang twice before a voice answered, low, smooth, and edged with the kind of confidence that came from wielding real power. "Shaq," the voice said, not as a question, but as recognition. "I need to talk," Shaq replied, his tone calm but firm. "Something's going down here, and it's bigger than it looks." The voice on the other end belonged to Victor Raines, a longtime ally in business and an unspoken partner in Shaq's quiet mission to challenge the unspoken rules of exclusion and prejudice that haunted the highest circles. Victor wasn't just a businessman. He was a strategist, a man who understood the subtle languages of influence and control, and more importantly, he shared Shaq's distaste for the old guard's way of doing things. "Tell me what's happening," Victor said, the ease in his tone belying the sharp focus behind his words. Shaq leaned against the polished chrome of a valet stand, his voice low and steady as he outlined the events. He described the way the lounge manager had dismissed him, the entitled smirk of the woman who had orchestrated it, and a thin veneer of politeness masking a deeper rot. But Shaq's recounting wasn't about personal slight. It was about what he sensed beneath the surface, the patterns he'd seen play out in boardrooms, country clubs, and now in the glittering confines of the Monarch. "This isn't just about me getting moved from a lounge," Shaq said, his voice hardening at the edges. "It's about the hotel's whole way of doing business. They're playing a dirty game, quiet favoritism, turning a blind eye, keeping their own circles tight and closed." Victor was silent for a beat, then let out a low whistle. "You've been watching them. Longer than they think," Shaq replied. The narrator revealed to the audience that this wasn't an impulsive call. Shaq had suspected for months that the Monarch was more than just a luxury hotel. It was a facade, a polished mask, hiding deals that excluded, silenced, and exploited. The insult in the lounge was just the spark that lit a fuse he'd been quietly laying. Victor's voice dropped, steel threading through the smoothness. "You want to pull the trigger?" Shaq's response was measured. "I'm done waiting. They made it clear today that it's not about respect or merit. It's about control. They think they can decide who belongs. I want them to understand they've underestimated the wrong man." The narrator wove suspense into the exchange, hinting at the scope of what was coming. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was a calculated, strategic move against a system that thrived on silent complicity. Victor's contacts were deep. Lawyers, auditors, board members with leverage, even regulators who could open inquiries with a well-placed word. Shaq wasn't calling to make threats. He was calling to turn a key that would unlock a full-scale exposure. "Give me 2 hours," Victor said, his tone now crisp, decisive. "I'll start the wheels turning. Quietly, by the time you're ready to make your move, they'll be off balance. You'll walk in, not just as a wronged guest, but as the man who owns the ground they're standing on." Shaq's lips twitched into a small, humorless smile. "That's what I'm counting on." As the call ended, Shaq stood still for a long moment, his phone lowering to his side. Around him, the Miami street bustled with life, valets jogging to fetch cars, tourists laughing under the hot sun, drivers honking at the slow midday traffic. But for Shaq, the noise faded into the background. The weight of what he was about to set in motion settled over him, not heavy like a burden, but sharp and clear like the edge of a blade. The narrator drew the audience deeper into the tension, the quiet storm gathering behind Shaq's composed exterior. This wasn't a man reacting in anger. This was a man stepping into his full power, using the very systems that tried to exclude him to expose their flaws. There would be no raised voices, no scenes of chaos. The reckoning would unfold with the same quiet precision as Shaq's movements, each step calculated, each word measured. As he turned back toward the hotel's gleaming doors, the staff's polite nods and quick glances were met with a cool, knowing gaze. They didn't know it yet, but the balance of power had shifted. The lounge's insult was a spark. Now the fire was quietly catching hold. The narrator's final note for this section promised the audience that the next steps would not just reclaim Shaq's dignity, they would shake the foundations of the Monarch itself. The Monarch's marble and glass perfection shimmered under the relentless Florida sun, but beneath its gleaming surface, fractures began to show. Small cracks that whispered of long-buried truths. The narrator's tone turned darker, peeling back the layers of this polished facade to reveal the undercurrents of exclusion and quiet corruption that had festered in the hotel's corridors for years. Behind closed doors, the manager, Dalton, had built a legacy of quiet power plays. His resume boasted a decade of service, marked by upward promotions and glowing recommendations, but the real story was whispered among staff who knew better. Dalton's approach was subtle but consistent, favoring wealthy white guests, smoothing over complaints with carefully chosen words, and making decisions that kept certain types of clientele comfortable, while others were subtly nudged aside. The narrator emphasized that it wasn't just a personal prejudice, it was a system, reinforced and rewarded by those who controlled the hotel's operations. In hushed conversations over late-night staff drinks, the whispers had been growing louder. Stories of reservations mysteriously lost, of complaints from minority guests conveniently misfiled, of staff members of color quietly shifted to less visible roles, or let go altogether. And now, with Shaq's incident sparking fresh tension, the hotel's workers were beginning to talk in corners, glances exchanged like coded messages. The narrator highlighted how the injustice wasn't a secret, but it had always been cloaked in enough plausible deniability to keep it from breaking into daylight. Months ago, Shaq had begun to suspect the Monarch's pristine image wasn't as spotless as it seemed. A chance comment from a business associate had planted the seed, and his instincts, honed over years of navigating elite spaces, told him to dig deeper. Quietly, he'd commissioned a private audit, a team of investigators who slipped through the hotel's polished halls unnoticed, gathering data, testimonies, patterns. The narrator described this effort as a silent war, a chess game played in shadows where every move counted. The audit had revealed what Shaq had suspected but needed proof to confront: a pattern of discriminatory practices woven into the hotel's operations. Certain clients, especially those connected to powerful circles, were given privileges that skirted legal and ethical boundaries. Incidents of staff harassment, of complaints swept under thick rugs of bureaucracy, and of hush money paid out to silence voices, had been carefully catalogued. The weight of evidence was enough to topple not just the hotel's reputation, but the very structure of its management. As the tension mounted, the narrator painted a vivid picture of staff whispers turning into quiet meetings in back hallways, the shuffle of papers, the click of encrypted emails being sent to anonymous addresses. Dalton's carefully maintained control was slipping, though he hadn't realized it yet. His complacency had made him careless, trusting that the same rules that had protected him for years would continue to shield him from consequence. But now cracks were forming in his walls of protection. The audience was pulled deeper into the tension as the narration described how Shaq's quiet dignity had become a rallying point. Some of the staff, long resigned to the hotel's unspoken rules, found courage in the way he had handled the insult in the lounge. They saw in his silence not weakness but strength, a refusal to be diminished or to lash out in ways that would validate the prejudice they faced. Whispers of his quiet resistance rippled through the hotel's staff, awakening a cautious hope. In the corridors where decisions were made, the upper management began to sense unease. Reports of the lounge incident had already reached the ears of the board, and murmurs of Shaq's quiet call to power were beginning to stir discomfort. The narrator revealed that Victor Raines had started his discreet maneuvers, pulling financial strings, making inquiries through his extensive network. Board members who had once been secure in their positions now found themselves fielding quiet calls, probing questions about the hotel's practices, and hints of regulatory scrutiny. Dalton, feeling the first tremors of something shifting beneath him, called an emergency meeting with his trusted inner circle. His voice was tight, his instructions clear: control the narrative, silence the staff rumors, and ensure that any external inquiries were deflected with polished statements. But as the narrator underscored, Dalton was already too late. The machinery of exposure had been set in motion, and it was running beyond his control. Shaq, meanwhile, observed from the edges, his phone alive with updates from Victor and his legal team. He didn't need to be in the hotel's boardroom to know that the walls were closing in. His move had been deliberate, calculated to disrupt not just the visible insult in the lounge, but the hidden rot that propped up the hotel's elite standing. The narrator described Shaq's thoughts, threading his quiet resolve with a sense of righteous purpose. This wasn't about revenge. It was about stripping away the layers of false civility that masked injustice, about forcing a reckoning in a space that had long thrived on silencing dissent. The scene tightened as night approached, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows through the Monarch's glass walls. Staff moved with subdued urgency, glancing over shoulders, tension crackling in every whispered conversation. Dalton's voice, once firm and commanding, now carried a thread of desperation as he barked orders. But the narrator assured the audience that the tide had already turned. Shaq's quiet call to power had sparked a chain reaction, one that wouldn't be stopped by hurried meetings or scripted press releases. And as the camera of narration pulled back from the busy hotel corridors, the audience was left with the image of Shaq standing alone outside, his phone at his side, the city lights flickering behind him. The underbelly of the Monarch had been exposed, and the quiet storm he had set in motion was gathering strength. The narrator promised that the coming confrontation would not just shake the hotel, it would crack the very foundations of the unspoken power that had held it together for so long. Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal re-entered the Monarch's grand lobby, the air inside thick with the muted hum of whispered conversations, and the rustle of staff scrambling to contain a situation spiraling beyond their control. His steps were measured, a quiet defiance carried not by raised voices or aggressive gestures, but by the calm certainty of a man who knew his power. In his hand, a slim folder of legal documents caught the light, the contents within carrying a weight far heavier than his towering frame. The narrator's tone shifted, highlighting the contrast between the hotel's elegant facade and the fraying composure of its staff. Managers huddled near the reception desk, their murmured voices sharp with tension, their polished masks slipping. Guests glanced toward Shaq as he crossed the floor, their curiosity piqued by the calm yet commanding presence that now seemed to command the room's air. Dalton, pale and sweating, emerged from a side hallway, his attempt at a confident stride marred by the nervous twitch of his hands. He opened his mouth to speak, to spin excuses, and weave control back into his grasp. But Shaq's gaze met his, and froze the words before they could form. Without a word, Shaq extended the folder, his posture relaxed, his expression composed but unyielding. The narrator revealed the weight of that folder, not just legalese, but a revelation: ownership papers, ironclad contracts, and the audit's damning evidence, all meticulously compiled and waiting for Dalton's trembling hands. Shaq's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet enough that the surrounding murmurs ceased to catch his words. "You know what this means." The narrator lingered on the significance of his tone, calm, without a hint of gloating, but infused with the power of truth made undeniable. Dalton's lips parted, a half-hearted protest forming. But Shaq didn't wait for it. His gaze shifted past Dalton, landing on the woman who had orchestrated his removal from the lounge. She stood near the entrance, her perfectly styled hair now slightly out of place, her phone clutched tightly in her manicured hand. Her smirk was gone, replaced by a tightening around her eyes that betrayed realization. The narrator leaned into her perspective, hinting at her sudden understanding that this wasn't merely a case of a powerful man reclaiming his dignity. It was something larger, something that threatened her own position. A twist unfolded as the narrator revealed her name, Charlotte Kincaid. She wasn't just an entitled guest with connections. She was tied by blood and business to the very corruption that had tainted the Monarch's foundation. The Kincaids, long known for their behind-the-scenes manipulations in the hospitality industry, had counted on the Monarch as a jewel in their crown, a place where power and privilege moved unseen beneath the glittering surface. Charlotte's role wasn't incidental. She was a strategic piece in a game designed to keep certain players on top and others out of sight. Shaq's eyes locked with hers for a heartbeat, and the unspoken message between them was clear. This wasn't personal, but it was final. Her role in his removal was no longer a private slight. It was now tangled in a web of accountability that her family's influence couldn't untangle. The narrator let the tension build as Charlotte's hand trembled slightly, her knuckles whitening around her phone. She knew in that moment that this wasn't just a PR scandal, it was a reckoning. Dalton finally found his voice, though it cracked under the weight of the moment. "Mr. O'Neill, surely we can resolve this without..." Shaq cut him off with a raised hand, the gesture simple but carrying the weight of finality. "I'm not here to argue," he said softly, the words slicing through the air like a quiet blade. "I'm here to make it right." The narrator emphasized the quiet force behind his words, the contrast between the chaos Dalton and Charlotte embodied and Shaq's unshakable calm. Victor Rains appeared from the elevator, his presence like the shadow of a silent storm. He moved to Shaq's side, a slim smile playing at the corner of his mouth. His voice, when he spoke, was smooth and edged with steel. "Our team has already begun the process. Ownership is no longer in question. The board will be informed by morning. And as for the rest..." His gaze flicked toward Charlotte, whose face had paled. "They'll find the audit enlightening." The staff, once bustling with quiet urgency, now stood frozen, the realization dawning that the man they had quietly dismissed had returned not just as a guest, but as an owner with the power to dismantle their carefully maintained hierarchy. Shaq's posture remained relaxed, but the narrator underscored the shift in dynamic. This was no longer a conversation, it was a declaration. As the tension hung thick, Shaq turned toward the entrance, his steps unhurried, his expression unreadable. The narrator painted the picture of Charlotte's shoulders sagging, the weight of her family's legacy pressing down like lead. Dalton's protests faded into a hollow echo behind him. The Monarch, so long a bastion of whispered exclusions and silent injustices, had been cracked open by the quiet, measured steps of a man who refused to be dismissed. Outside, the evening sun cast long, golden shadows across the hotel's facade. The narrator's voice softened but remained edged with quiet power. Shaq stood at the top of the marble steps, the weight of the hotel's history behind him, and the promise of something new ahead. The confrontation was over, but the real change was just beginning. The audience was left with the unshakable image of a man who, with nothing but truth and resolve, had shaken an empire to its foundations. The dawn after Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal's quiet confrontation with the Monarch didn't rise gently. It exploded into headlines, social media feeds, and buzzing newsrooms. Outside the towering hotel, cameras jostled for position as reporters barked questions into the humid Miami air, their lenses fixed on the entrance where Shaq's calm, unwavering presence had turned the tide the night before. The hotel's polished marble facade now seemed less like a symbol of luxury and more like a crumbling mask slipping from a corrupt face. The narrator's tone sharpened, heightening the suspense. This wasn't just a story of a celebrity standing his ground. It was a public unveiling of systemic rot, of silent complicity finally forced into the light. The crowd of journalists surged as Shaq stepped forward from the glass doors, his tall frame steady amid the chaos. Reporters shouted questions about the ownership transfer, the audit, the whispered discrimination. Microphones bristled toward him like a phalanx of weapons, but Shaq's voice, when he finally spoke, carried above them all, deep, steady, measured. "I didn't come here for headlines," he said, his words chosen with precision. "This isn't about me getting a room or a seat in a lounge. This is about respect, dignity, and fairness. Things that should belong to everyone, not just a select few." His gaze swept the crowd, pinning their attention not with celebrity charisma, but with quiet integrity. The narrator drew the audience deeper into the shift. How the personal insult Shaq had endured was now transformed into a collective story of injustice. How his refusal to be silenced was amplifying voices long ignored. Inside the hotel, the management scrambled. Press releases were drafted with corporate polish, Statements of regret were prepared, and legal teams whispered hurriedly into phones. Dalton's name was already circulating online as the face of the incident, while Charlotte Kincaid's identity, once shielded by layers of privilege, was beginning to emerge in whispered social media threads and investigative blogs. The narrator highlighted how their frantic attempts to control the narrative were failing in the face of mounting public scrutiny. The old tools of silence and dismissal were crumbling under the weight of visibility. Victor Raines stood just inside the glass doors, his phone pressed to his ear, his tone clipped and efficient. He wasn't interested in damage control. He was orchestrating the next moves, contacting regulators, coordinating with Shaq's legal team, ensuring that the hotel's practices were not just exposed but addressed. The narrator underscored how Victor's role, though quiet, was pivotal. His network of influence, and his strategic mind turning the chaos into a calculated push for accountability. As the crowd outside swelled, a sudden hush fell. Shaq raised his hand slightly, and the reporters quieted, their microphones tilting forward. The narrator wove in the tension of the moment, the audience holding its breath for what would come next. Shaq's voice remained steady, his words deliberate. "This isn't just about the Monarch," he said. "It's about how easy it is to ignore people who don't fit the mold, how easy it is to turn away from unfairness when it doesn't affect you directly. But that ends now, not just here, but everywhere." The applause that followed wasn't raucous. It was a slow building wave of acknowledgement, of understanding. The reporters weren't just chronicling a scandal. They were witnessing a shift in narrative, from isolated incident to broader movement. Shaq's refusal to frame himself as a victim resonated, his determination to redirect the spotlight toward systemic change, sparking something deeper than mere sympathy. In the background, Charlotte Kincaid was escorted discreetly out a side entrance, her face pale, her phone pressed tightly to her ear as damage control efforts collapsed around her. The narrator revealed the hidden irony. Her family's long-standing control over hospitality businesses, once seen as untouchable, was now unraveling under the weight of public outrage. And Shaq's unshakable integrity. Dalton, too, faced a reckoning. His carefully constructed image, once propped up by whispered alliances and unspoken agreements, was dissolving. His attempts to spin the situation as a misunderstanding were drowned out by evidence. The audit's revelations, staff testimonies, and Shaq's quiet dignity, all converging into a narrative too strong to contain. The media storm built momentum. The narrator threading through scenes of headlines splashed across televisions, online articles dissecting the Monarch's history, and social media feeds, buzzing with hashtags calling for accountability. Celebrities and public figures lent their voices, amplifying the story's reach. The shift was palpable. What had begun as a personal slight was now a rallying cry against systemic prejudice, a call to action that echoed far beyond the hotel's glittering facade. Amid the chaos, Shaq remained steady. He didn't gloat, didn't fuel the flames of scandal. Instead, he focused on the message, the need for fairness, respect, and lasting change. The narrator emphasized how his calm amidst the media frenzy added weight to his words, showing that his purpose was not revenge, but reform. His presence reminded everyone watching that true power wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet, resolute, and rooted in unwavering principles. As the sun climbed higher in the Miami sky, the crowd outside the Monarch grew, not with angry protesters, but with those seeking to bear witness to a moment where justice was demanded and dignity reclaimed. The narrator's voice softened but remained edged with determination, hinting that this wasn't the story's end, but a pivotal chapter in a much larger fight. Shaq's quiet stand had torn through layers of silence, his integrity sparking a movement that wouldn't fade when the cameras turned away. The final image of the scene was Shaq standing at the edge of the marble steps, his silhouette outlined against the bright sky, his expression calm yet resolute. The media buzzed around him, but he remained a still point amid the storm, a symbol not of scandal but of the unwavering strength it took to confront injustice with dignity and turn a personal insult into a spark for collective change. As the media storm swirled with unstoppable momentum, a new twist coiled through the narrative, like a hidden knife. The white woman, the one whose smug demand had triggered the cascade, stepped from the shadows of public silence and into the blinding glare of camera flashes. Her name, now revealed, Charlotte Kincaid. But what startled even the seasoned reporters wasn't her presence, it was her pedigree. The Kincaid family name, long whispered with reverence, in political and business corridors, carried weight. Their influence, their money, their deep connections to those who controlled city boards and corporate empires had made them nearly untouchable. Now Charlotte's ties to this web of power painted her actions in a sharper, darker light. The narrator drew the audience closer, describing how Charlotte, cornered and exposed, attempted to regain control of the narrative. Carefully staged interviews appeared on sympathetic networks, where she cast herself as the misunderstood party. Tearfully, she claimed her encounter with Shaq had been misrepresented. She painted herself as the victim of a vengeful celebrity wielding his influence to bully an innocent woman. The lines of her face were carefully softened by makeup, her voice trembling just enough to evoke sympathy. But the audience wasn't fooled. Shaq watched from a distance, his jaw tightening but his composure unbroken. He knew this was the predictable counterstrike, the reflex of those accustomed to tilting the scales in their favor. The narrator emphasized the weight of his restraint, the choice he made to remain silent while the story spun further into falsehoods. Reporters clamored for his response, microphones thrust toward him with questions designed to provoke outrage or rebuttal. But Shaq only shook his head softly and said, "I'm not here to fight with her. This isn't about me or her, it's about something bigger." Behind closed doors, the Monarch's board met in frantic sessions. Their polished conference rooms, once havens of calculated deals and strategic alliances, now crackled with tension. The audit's revelations were too damning to suppress, and the media backlash had made quiet settlements impossible. Charlotte's attempt to frame herself as a victim was beginning to backfire. Her family's name, once a shield, now appeared as an emblem of entrenched privilege, clashing with rising public fury. The board's carefully constructed image of elite hospitality was unraveling, thread by thread. Desperate to stem the bleeding, the board extended an offer, a carefully worded public apology. They drafted statements acknowledging errors in judgment, promising reforms and oversight, even hinting at a possible donation to diversity initiatives. They hoped to wrap it all in a polished press conference, with Shaq standing beside them, a symbol of reconciliation. But when the proposal was delivered, Shaq's response was clear and quiet. No. The narrator's voice slowed, adding weight to his refusal. Shaq wasn't interested in a public relations performance or a payout wrapped in apologies. His refusal wasn't loud, but it resonated like a bell tolling the end of pretense. "This isn't about me getting an apology," he said, his voice steady as he addressed a gathering of reporters outside the hotel. "It's not about a donation, or a check or a photo op. It's about tearing down the walls that let this happen in the first place. It's about making sure that the next person, who doesn't have my platform, doesn't get quietly shown the door and told they don't belong. That's the only apology I'm willing to accept." The narrator heightened the tension, weaving in the board's stunned reaction. Their strategy, so long successful in deflecting scandals with a combination of polished words and silent checks, was failing. Their power to contain the fallout was slipping through their fingers. The audience felt the stakes deepen. The story was no longer about Shaq's personal insult, but about systemic change, about a man using his platform not to demand restitution but to insist on reform. Charlotte's smear campaign faltered under the weight of public scrutiny. Her carefully crafted narratives crumbled as investigative reporters dug deeper into her family's history of quiet deals and backroom favors. Social media flooded with accounts of similar dismissals, of voices long silenced by polished walls and whispered threats. The tide had turned, not because Shaq shouted louder, but because he chose not to shout at all. His quiet refusal to play the game on their terms resonated more powerfully than any counterattack could. Victor Reigns moved behind the scenes, his quiet maneuvers ensuring that regulatory bodies were not just alerted, but actively involved. Internal investigations were launched, subpoenas issued, whispers of deeper misconduct emerged, rippling beyond the Monarch's walls, into the larger network of businesses tied to the Kincaids. The narrator painted a picture of a system unraveling under the pressure of truth long suppressed. As the sun dipped low over Miami, casting a burnished glow over the hotel's once imposing facade, Shaq stood alone on the marble steps. The narrator's voice softened, threading through his quiet contemplation. He wasn't there for a photo op or a victory lap. His stance wasn't triumphant, but resolute. A man who had refused to let his story be twisted, who had chosen to fight not with anger, but with principle. The weight of what he'd set in motion hung in the air, heavy with both the cost and the promise of change. The audience was left with a lasting image of Shaq's silhouette framed against the twilight sky, the media lights flickering around him. His quiet, principled stand had not just shifted public opinion, it had cracked the foundations of a system built on silence and exclusion. The story was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, and to those who now saw for the first time that change was possible. In the days that followed the public reckoning at the Monarch, the city buzzed with speculation. News vans still lined the curb outside the now infamous hotel. Reporters camped with cameras ready, waiting for another headline. Rumors swirled in hushed conversations about lawsuits, boardroom upheavals, whispered resignations. But amidst the noise and chaos, Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal moved with quiet resolve, his plan already unfolding behind the scenes. The narrator wove the story's threads into something deeper, hinting that this wasn't just a battle of ownership, it was a calculated move toward redemption. On a crisp, clear morning, Shaq stepped to the podium set up at the foot of the Monarch's grand steps. The hotel loomed behind him, its gleaming glass reflecting the pale blue sky. But the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Reporters surged forward, microphones and cameras trained on him, but he held up a hand, commanding attention without a single word. The crowd settled, the hum of the city fading into a tense, expectant silence. "I know what you're all waiting to hear," Shaq began, his voice resonant but measured. "You've heard the rumors about ownership, about shutdowns, about lawsuits. But that's not the story I'm here to tell." The narrator's tone deepened, emphasizing the deliberate pace of his words. The audience felt the weight of something larger unfolding, something that wasn't about vengeance or scandal, but about purpose. "The Monarch," Shaq continued, "as it stands today, will cease to exist, but it won't be torn down, and it won't be boarded up. Instead, it will be reimagined, reborn into something this city, and this country, desperately need." The shift in the crowd was palpable. Reporters exchanged startled glances. Pens hovered over notepads. The tension of anticipation thickened. The narrator painted the scene in vivid strokes. Shaq's plan wasn't to level the building and erase its tainted past. Instead, he intended to transform it into a community hub, a space where barriers of privilege and exclusion would crumble, a place where minority entrepreneurs could launch their businesses, where local artists could display their work without gatekeepers, where young people could gather to learn and create in an environment free of judgment. Victor Raines stood a few steps behind Shaq, his presence quiet but affirming. His network of contacts had already begun laying the groundwork, restructuring ownership, securing permits, reaching out to community leaders. But it was Shaq's vision that breathed life into the plan. The narrator revealed how this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision but a long-considered move, one that had taken shape in Shaq's mind long before the lounge incident. He had always believed in using his influence, not just to rise, but to lift others. "This won't be easy," Shaq said, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of responsibility. "There will be resistance. Systems don't like to change, and power doesn't like to share. But this isn't about them. It's about all of us." The narrator underscored the quiet courage in his tone, the refusal to be cowed by the machinery of wealth and privilege that had long operated unchecked. As he spoke, the audience could almost see the blueprint forming behind his words. Conference rooms repurposed as startup incubators, suites transformed into affordable creative studios, banquet halls reimagined as public gathering spaces. The Monarch's luxurious veneer would remain, but its soul would be reshaped, its opulence redirected to serve those who had once been excluded from its gilded gates. The narrator injected a note of suspense, acknowledging the looming question: could Shaq really pull this off in a system stacked against him? The Kincaid family's reach was long, their connections deep. There would be legal challenges, regulatory hurdles, orchestrated opposition. But the strength of Shaq's plan lay not in brute force, but in collective will. He wasn't standing alone. Behind him, a coalition of community leaders, activists, and business allies were already aligning their efforts, galvanized by his stand. Reporters peppered him with questions about timelines, budgets, feasibility. Shaq fielded them with calm precision, his answers practical but laced with hope. The narrator conveyed how his vision wasn't naive optimism. It was hard-earned belief in the power of community, in the resilience of those who had always found ways to thrive in the margins. Charlotte Kincaid watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. The narrator hinted at the shifting sands beneath her feet, the realization that her family's quiet dominion over places like the Monarch was no longer unchallenged. The old ways of wielding influence through silence and exclusion were crumbling, and she could see it in the firm line of Shaq's jaw, in the resolute set of his shoulders. As the press conference concluded, the crowd rippled with murmurs, reporters rushing to file stories not of scandal but of unexpected transformation. The narrator drew the audience into a moment of stillness, where Shaq stood against the backdrop of the gleaming hotel, now a symbol not of exclusion, but of potential. His presence wasn't one of gloating triumph, but of determined grace, of a man who had chosen to build something lasting, rather than revel in tearing down. In the quiet that followed, Victor stepped closer, murmuring a brief update about permits and community meetings. Shaq nodded, his gaze distant but focused. The narrator suggested that the real work was only beginning, that the redemption move was not a conclusion, but an opening act in a longer, harder fight. But the seeds had been planted, and the soil was fertile with the promise of change. As Shaq turned to leave, the cameras clicked furiously, capturing his silhouette framed by the morning sun. The narrator's final note for this section was a quiet promise to the audience. Redemption wasn't a singular act, but a commitment, a decision to keep standing, keep pushing, and keep believing in a world where dignity and opportunity were not privileges, but rights. The sun rose over Miami, casting its warm light over the newly christened building that had once been the Monarch Hotel. Now its name, the Horizon Collective, was etched in bold letters above the gleaming glass entrance, a name that whispered of new beginnings, of vision unclouded by prejudice. Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal stood before the entrance, the city skyline stretched behind him, and the air thick with the energy of something greater than a single victory. Community leaders flanked him, their faces lit with quiet pride, their presence a testament to the seismic shift that had begun. Young people gathered, some with notepads clutched in their hands, others simply staring up at Shaq with a mixture of awe and hope. The narrator's voice swelled, describing how this wasn't a gathering of fans or a spectacle for the press. It was a congregation of voices, long silenced, now finding space to rise. Shaq's expression was serene, but resolute, the weight of his journey pressing gently against his shoulders. The narrative traced the path that had led him here, from the quiet insult in a polished lounge to the rippling revelations that had cracked open a system's veneer. His journey had not been one of brute force or vengeance, but of quiet resilience, of unwavering dignity that refused to be diminished. Reporters, still present but now observers rather than aggressors, stood respectfully at the edge of the crowd, recording the scene with a mixture of reverence and curiosity. No shouted questions, no clamoring for sound bites. The story had already spoken louder than any headline. Shaq's presence alone was statement enough. The narrator revealed the subtle twist that had been threading through the story. The realization dawning now for those watching, that this had not been a spontaneous rebellion, sparked by a single slight. Shaq's moves, from the first quiet audit to the decisive call to Victor Reigns, were part of a long-laid plan. His eyes had been on more than the monarch. His goal had been to dismantle the quiet, unspoken barriers woven through elite spaces, to challenge a network of silent exclusions that spanned beyond one hotel's walls. Victor stood nearby, his posture relaxed but his eyes watchful, knowing the work wasn't done but understanding that this moment mattered. He exchanged a glance with Shaq. No words, just an acknowledgement of shared purpose. The narrator's tone softened, hinting at the layers of loyalty and trust that had carried this plan forward, unseen by those accustomed to the surface game. Children approached Shaq, some timid, others emboldened by the warmth in his gaze. He knelt to speak with them, listening more than talking, his presence a grounding force. The narrator painted these moments with subtle brushstrokes, the quiet exchange of encouragement and the planting of seeds of belief that change wasn't just possible, it was real. Charlotte Kincaid was absent from the scene, her family's influence receding into silence. The quiet vacuum her departure left behind was filled with the voices of those stepping into the space she and others like her had guarded so fiercely. The Horizon Collective wasn't just a building, it was a symbol, a declaration that the old ways would no longer be tolerated. The narrator made it clear that this wasn't a triumph of a single man, but a collective reclamation of dignity. As Shaq straightened, the sun catching the edges of his broad frame, he spoke not into microphones, but directly to those gathered before him. His voice was low but carried with effortless authority. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's the beginning. This place is for all of us. For the kids who never thought they'd see their art on these walls. For the entrepreneurs who were told their ideas didn't belong. For the voices that were kept out, told they didn't fit. This is for you. And it's just the start." The crowd responded not with cheers, but with a collective murmur of understanding, of agreement that resonated deeper than applause. The narrator captured the shared breath, the unspoken promise of support and solidarity that hung in the air. The story didn't need a dramatic finale. It needed this moment of quiet power, where the weight of what had been accomplished settled into the bones of the city. As the camera of narration pulled back, the city's streets began to stir with the start of a new day. The Horizon Collective gleamed in the morning light, its windows reflecting the sky not as a barrier but as an invitation. The narrator's voice swelled with a message of justice, dignity, and hope for change. This wasn't a fleeting moment or a media spectacle. It was a shift, a reclamation of space and voice that would echo far beyond these glass walls. Shaq's silhouette, surrounded by leaders, artists and children, was no longer just the image of a man who had stood up for himself. It was the image of a movement taking root. The narrator closed the story with a promise, not of perfection, but of persistence, of the quiet, enduring power of those who refuse to be silenced, who choose to rebuild, not just walls but communities. In the hush that followed as the crowd began to disperse, the sense lingered that something had irrevocably changed. The old ways of quiet exclusions and unspoken hierarchies had been shattered, and in their place stood the Horizon Collective, a beacon of possibility, born not from anger, but from the unshakable belief that justice, dignity, and hope were not privileges, but rights. Join the journey where power is redefined, and justice isn't a headline, it's a movement. Dive deeper into stories that crack the surface of silence and rebuild spaces with truth and resilience. Stay connected where real change begins, and witness the quiet power that transforms communities. The next chapter is yours to help shape.